gradients. This video is all about gradients. And yes, the title is a little bit like one trick to improve your Minecraft builds instantly. Click now to see how. No, this is about gradients. And what is a gradient? Well, it's basically this. A line of blocks that takes you from one color as smoothly as possible to another. So this one is from black to white, and it's got lots of different shades of gray in between. This is a great gradient in Minecraft because we have lots of shades available for us to use. So the idea in this video is to give you an idea of how to use one of these to improve your builds. Now, to quickly demonstrate this, I've got a few examples to show you. So, I whipped up this build here. It looks pretty nice, but I intentionally used just stone as the wall. And this is totally okay. It's a very subjective thing whether this improves or doesn't improve. All I want to say is that gradients can change the way that your builds look in Minecraft. So, this is our base house. Now over to the right, we have a gradient from a dark grey to a slightly lighter grey. But as you can see, texture plays a big role in this. The busier the texture, the more off-putting it can be. However, I think this version of the house does look better than the plain version. And another thing to note is when you're using gradients, it looks better the further back you go. Now I've got a few more examples. I've got one that goes from light grey to white, and I think this one really looks quite nice. And I've got one that goes from very dark black all the way to sort of a dark grey. All of these examples demonstrate just how much using a gradient as your walls in your building can change the way your house looks. Okay, so now that you understand the concept that we're going to be doing, let's talk about how you actually go about doing it and some advice on how to use them. So, I've provided you with this big long line of blocks, and this is going to be our gradient. Now, as you can see, over there, I didn't include a house that went all the way from this to that. Because mainly, when you use a gradient, you don't just have one line of blocks. No. If you want a gradient, it really needs to be at least a couple of blocks tall. And then the idea would be that you mix it up as you go along, like so. So there's no hard line in between them. It goes steadily from one to the other. Now, the process that I use is that I lay out a gradient like this in front of the build. Kind of like I did here, where you can see all the colors and you can use this as your reference guide. So you can see the darker color has gone at the bottom, and then as it gets progressively lighter, we move up the building. Now you can do this any way you like, but I prefer to have a darker color at the bottom and the lighter at the top, so that when you look at the building, your eyes are naturally drawn upwards. It can make your builds look a little bit taller. Depending on how big your build is will determine how many of these blocks you can realistically use. My house over there is reasonably tall, but it's not massive. So I would use about 6 blocks from the gradient, but you can use as many as 3. So I wanted to demonstrate why it's important to make sure you use the correct amount, because it really affects the way that your build looks. So what I've got here is 2 stone pillars. On this one, I'm going to use every single color on the gradient. On this one, I'm only going to use 3. And what we should see is a very drastic effect on this pillar and a more subtle one on this. Both are unique in their own ways, and it's designed to give you an idea of what might be the most appropriate for your build. So, let's do a quick time lapse of what these two will look like. So the left pillar will have one of every single block in our gradient, and as you can see, it's a little bit more tedious and inventory management, whereas the right hand side took next to no time at all and a lot less blocks. Something to bear in mind. Our 2 completed towers end up having a very different effect. Now, one of the things that I want to point out to you, and I mentioned earlier, is that gradients look better the further away you are. And there's no better way to demonstrate this than with these 2 towers, as the further I get away from them, the less pronounced the transition becomes. And in fact, on the left-hand side, you can see that there's 4 distinct areas of colour instead of 18 or whatever it is. And on the right, you can barely tell that there's anything at all, highlighting that this one is far more subtle than many different kinds of blocks. For example, my mansion on Season 7 of Hermitcraft uses this effect, and these houses here use more of a detailed effect. So what I thought we'd do is, now that you've seen what we can do with gradients, we would go through one together. I've highlighted a gradient that I think would look really nice with this particular house made of stone. And I recorded this in 1.17, or at least a snapshot of it at the time of recording, because you get a really nice block available called the moss block. And this transition, I feel, will make it look like there's a lot of natural things growing up the building. So let's go over the process of actually implementing a gradient into a build like this, assuming that you have a house that has one block. So the first thing, of course, is to lay out your gradient like so in front of your building from dark to light. And I like to start from the bottom, so what I've done is gone and added in these moss blocks just down here. Now, one thing that I didn't mention earlier, as to not overload you with tons and tons of information, but when you do a gradient, you don't always have to do equal parts of each color. For example, on this one, I feel like it will look better if all of the green parts are occupying the very bottom of it, so that it looks like it's only growing up very slowly. So the way that I make this naturally progress into other colors is the bottom layer is all 100% moss. Then you just implement just 1 or 2 on the second layer, and then very few on the third layer. 3 layers is a really good range for spreading the block over the build. And we'll do something very similar with the green concrete powder. So again, because this is meant to spread over 3, we probably want to keep it fairly light going. And what you want to avoid is lots of patterns. So for example, a way not to do this would be 1 on, 1 off, 1 on, 1 off, 1 on, because it then ends up looking like teeth. You really need to try and create a lot of variation amongst it. So we take the action of spreading out each block over 3 and basically mix all of them as we make our way up the building. You know, this is actually starting to look really cool already. Now, it's possible when you lay out your gradient, it looks great here, but when you actually put it on the building, it may end up looking a little bit odd. So don't feel like you need to be committed 100% to the gradient. If you need to swap out any singular block, I thoroughly encourage you to do so. Or you may feel like you need an extra one. Gradients take a little while to really understand and come to grips with. So the thing that you want to do is always take a really long step back and assess what's going on here. So I've just taken a step back, and I actually think what I've done, the mistake I've made, is I've got way too much green. I think the green, or the concrete powder at least, really wants to stop much further down than this. So what I'm going to do is eliminate some of the green layers and basically push the hard color down a bit. And there we go, I've just edited it, and that works a lot better. Yes, there's a solid line of green that will go around this, but it's way more subtle. So what I'm going to do now is basically continue, once I'm happy with one small segment of it, I'm basically going to continue this all the way around the build and see what it looks like. And I've managed to wrap it round the entire build. And you know what? I think this might be my absolute favorite gradient of all time. This new moss block is a bit of a game changer. And the reason that I love this the most is because it, in a sense, represents a reality of some sort. You could have actual vegetation that's creeping its way up this old looking building. And you'll also notice that I've kind of broken my own rules a little bit, because using the mossy cobble, I actually made it creep up way further than it really should. And this gives the impression that there's actually like a bit of vines growing as well. And also, I've got to do a big shout out for Glow Lichen, because this actually adds an awful lot as well. Now, I feel like I've explained pretty much all about how to make a gradient work in your build, but there's a couple of extra little bits of information that I need to give you before I depart. So, number 1 is that you need to let go of what a block is called or made of. For example, most people will be like, oh, gravel? I wouldn't use gravel as a building block. What? Or the most common one that I hear is wool. I wouldn't use wool. When building in gradients, you need to look at the color and the texture. It really doesn't matter what it's called. It's simply a means to a color scheme. So to wrap this video up, now that I've shown you all the different kinds of gradients, how to put them in, and what they can do for your builds, it's time to give you a bit of a cheat sheet list of all the different kinds of gradients that I can come up with. And a big shout out to Pearlescent Moon as well, who's helping me put together these gradients. Then you can just choose which color you like and take it and implement it into your build. But I would also like to know which one of these is your favorite. For me, personally, I quite like this one, but I think it just tops out with the reality moss growing house over here. So let's take a look at all these different kinds of gradients. So here we are, we've got a bunch of different gradients. Now this doesn't mean that every single blue block is in here, just the ones that we think you will find the most useful. Now it's also worth noting that you are unlikely to include a gradient from all of these available. It's more likely you're going to choose somewhere between 6 to 10 of these at most. So I'm just going to pop up here and give you a chance to get a really good idea of all of the different colors. I'm not going to go through each and every single one of these blocks because that would take a long time, and you should be able to identify which ones they are. And some of them are a little less intuitive, like this one goes from dark brown to light brown, then all the way kind of to the creamy color of sand. The blue goes from dark blue all the way up to the prismarine, and then we've got greens. Yellow is pretty lackluster, I must admit, and then you've got some of the lighter shades there. Orange, which is great for sort of space age stuff. The dark red for your more evilly looking builds. And then this one is a unique one, which is kind of an orange that goes to pink. This one is also quite a nice palette to use. So there you are, all of the gradients that we feel you will find useful. So this one trick should, in theory, change the way that you build. If you do have a build, take a picture beforehand and then try and apply a gradient and do a before and after picture. It'd be really interesting to see how they look. And of course, building is completely subjective, so if you like to keep it completely plain, you can. Thank you very much for watching, and goodbye.